Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to texture the stylized lamppost model in InstaMAT with the layering project. Now we have already covered how to model and sculpt the asset, get the unwrap, set the materials, and also export the models required for texturing. So you can refer to that video to recreate this model. Anyways, let's get to texturing. Alright, I have InstaMAT open. Let's create a new project. Asset texturing. Give it a name. And we can pick the low poly model. Since we separated our objects with materials, we can have multi-material option selected and just create without a template. Now we have the low poly model loaded into the project. On the left we have all the settings for the model, and as per the materials we set in Blender, we have our objects separated as we give two different materials for the group of objects, and you can hide these material groups from visibility. So to hide everything that shares the material, this is what you will find to turn on or off the visibility for anything in InstaMAT's layering section. You can also select the render mode. We only have opaque, but if you have any transparent textures for something like glass, this is where you will find them. So let's begin baking. Open the mesh baking tab. First, select the high poly mesh as the source mesh. We can use GPU. For the resolution, 2K is fine. Remaining things, we can leave them at default. Normally, I like to bake all these maps separately so I can focus on one and fix any issues with the baking. However, I already tried and didn't find any major issues with the bakes, so for now we can just bake them all at once. We don't really need thickness for this project, so we can turn that off. Position and normal are fine. Now, mesh ID is something super useful. We can save a lot of time for masking with this map. This basically separates all the parts and assigns a random color that we can easily use to mask things. We have the individual source mesh option. With this, it separates every unique objects in the model. So the bolts, the metal parts, and the wooden beams, as they are separate objects, will be assigned a different color. So for curvature and ambient occlusion, I found the defaults to work fine for the most part. You can increase these samples for better quality bakes, but I like the noise that we get with the ambient occlusion, which adds an organic look to it. So we can just go ahead and bake. Before that, we need to change the targeting mode to by mesh name, as we organized our low poly and high poly models with proper names, and we want to use that to get the proper bakes. But I want to demonstrate why we do this in case you are new to texturing, but you can just leave it at by mesh name and continue. So just bake this. And we are done with the bake. As you can see, all the high poly details are transferred, and we also have all the mesh maps assigned properly to each material. You can inspect them in your assets under images and double click to open the image in the image viewer. Now let's see the reason to use by mesh name. If we go close to the lamp, you can see the artifacts we got here. Basically, the details from this claw-like shape is being projected onto the surface. We will find similar problems at the bottom. Right now, InstaMAT is considering this whole thing as a single object, and every part of the high poly is being projected onto every part of the low poly. As this object is fairly small, the cage is basically overlapping due to the ray length value. You can try to play with the ray length settings to fix this, but then again we have the wooden parts which are much larger, and lowering the ray length might cause clipping for the high poly details. So instead we can change it to by mesh name, and we have the suffixes that you can set. You can change it to whatever you set in your 3D modeling program. And in our case, we just use _high and _low for the objects in Blender. And since we have all the claw shapes as one object for low poly and high poly respectively, they will bake onto themselves without interacting with the other meshes for the normal map. And we have this part separated for the low poly and high poly, so this part isn't going to project on the surface. Another thing I forgot to mention is that if you hit C on your keyboard, you can cycle through different texture preview channels. If you cycle through, you will find the normal map and you can inspect the artifacts and the map here. You can also open the image and try to inspect that, but being able to see it in the 3D view will make it much easier, and you can see the parts where we have the problem. So let's open up baking and bake again with proper settings. So choose by mesh name and we can bake this again now. Since we already baked the mesh maps earlier, it will ask us whether we want to replace the existing baked maps or keep them both. In this case, we can just replace them and choose repeat for all, so it does that for all the maps. Close the baking tab, and now you can see we don't have those artifacts from earlier. We still see the artifacts in the image as it didn't refresh, but just double click to open the image again and it should load in. And we are getting some other artifacts here, but it's not really noticeable right now, so just ignore that for now. If we find that to be causing issues in any part later, we could try to fix that by maybe adjusting the ray length. But right now it's not really noticeable on the mesh, so we can just leave that. Again, we can use C to cycle through the maps, and here we have the ID map. Everything is separated with a unique color, and we can use this for the mask. That is pretty much all for the bakes. To go back to the material, you can do that by hitting M. Right now, I don't think there is a way to view the baked ambient occlusion and curvature map on the model like this. I'm not too sure on this, at least I wasn't able to find any way to do that, but if you guys found something like that, you can let me know in the comments. You could anyways add a layer with the ambient occlusion or curvature to get a preview of that. That's it for the baking, and we saw where to input all the baked maps and also hide objects based on their material. Also, you have the two materials on top, and you can switch between them when texturing. So a separate layer stack for each material, and if we add a multi-channel layer here, it's only affecting the lamp as we have that selected. You can add one to the main structure as well. And that's how you would switch between the two materials when you're layering. That's it for the baking and setting up, and we can move on to texturing the asset. Now we can start texturing the asset. First, I want to work on the main wooden structure and the lamp later. So change the active material to the lamp structure. We can also turn off the visibility for the lamp for now, so we can get to texturing. So let's begin texturing. First, let's do the wood. Since we have the metal parts and the wooden parts, I like to create groups and set the mask before we start. So create two groups and name them. Add a new layer under each group so we can see what's happening. Put it under the group. Now we can add a mask to the folder so it only affects the wooden parts. You can use different masks that are available. There are multiple ways to do this, but since we baked an ID map, we can use that. Add a mesh ID mask. By default, it assigns a single color. You can use the color picker to select any of the parts. We can increase the count for this. Set it to 3 as we have 3 wooden parts. Now this gives a random color to start with, but you can just color pick the right parts. You can solo the mask by hitting S to see what it looks like. Now whatever layers we add underneath the folder will only affect the wood since we set the mask to the whole folder. Let's do the same thing for the metal as well. Add a multi-channel layer, pick a different color so it's easy to differentiate. Add a mesh ID mask and start selecting the colors. If you want to add more, you can do that up to a maximum of 10. But if your object has more than 10 parts to it, you can create another ID mask and set the blend mode for the mask to add. Now you can select the other parts. This doesn't work on multiply because any part that is multiplied by black, which is a value of 0, will also become 0, and whichever part we didn't pick a color for is just completely black. Hope that made sense. This is just in case 10 is not enough, and we can just delete the mask by hitting the delete selected layer. Now we have those two. Turn off the metal for now and start working on the wood. Rename this to base. By the way, this is the mapping settings and the layer channels next to it. Set the base color for this. Pick something brown. We can change it later if we need to. Also turn on the roughness and set a base value for that. Next, we can look to give the ambient occlusion and curvature details. Create a new layer. Add a mask builder to this. Increase the ambient occlusion opacity. You can see how it is affecting the mesh, and just adjust the values if needed. Let's give it a dark brown color. Set the blend mode to multiply and adjust the parameters to control how it looks. You can hit C to check the base color, so it's easier to figure out what the layer is adding exactly. I want these lines to be darker. Now ambient occlusion doesn't work great for that, but we can use the curvature map. So let's add another layer. Rename this. Add another mask builder. We can use curvature, but instead of edges, select cavities. So this only affects the lines. Set the color for this. Set that to multiply. And you can try to adjust the values. Also, we could have turned on curvature for the same mask layer, but I like the control of having these two details as two separate layers and adjusting the blend mode for each of them. Next, add another layer for curvature. Add a mask builder, increase the curvature opacity, and we can do the highlights. Set the color to a bright yellow. Try different blend modes. We can adjust the values for the curvature. Right now it's very low quality and pixelated. That is because we have the resolution set to 1024. Change that to 2048 as we are working with that resolution for this project. You can set a lower resolution in case you are lagging in the viewport. and just adjust the resolution when you need it. We can add some variation and breakup to the base color. Add a new layer after the base color before the ambient occlusion and curvature. Pick a mask builder, and this time we can use a grunge. For the image we can try moisture. Play with the values to get the look that you like. Pick a darker color for this. Set it to multiply. You can solo the mask to adjust it more easily. To get that stylized look, we can add filters to the mask. Select the mask and you can add filters. By the way, you can add filters directly to the layer as well, so be careful of that. Right now the filter is affecting the layer and not the mask. So if we select the mask and add that, then it's affecting only the mask. That is indicated by this icon here. Again, we have one filter for this layer and one mask. We want to affect the mask. So now we have two elements in the mask and the filter is affecting only the mask. This is represented by the two elements on the mask here. For this mask, let's add a slope warp. You will probably not see that option here. You will only see the filters that are marked as favorite, but you can hit pick from library and you have a bunch of additional filters available here. We can pick slope blur or slope warp. They work very similarly. I will choose slope warp for this. Right now it is defaulted to the noise image, but we can pick any noise. I will use clouds. And you can play with the scale and intensity. This adds a nice stylized painted look. Rename the layer to noise. Instead of using warp, feel free to experiment with other warps and filters that are available. Another thing to note is, if you look closely, you will find cuts near these scenes because of the slope warp. This can get very noticeable. Essentially, this is because the warps and blurs work on the texture in the UV space. So be careful not to overdo this, but in this case it's not that visible, so we can get away with it. You can try to add a mesh painting mask on top to try and fix these seams if they are a big problem, but for now this should be fine. Also, this would be noticeable if we didn't have any other layers on top, but the curvature is covering that quite a bit. Now it's a good idea to get some roughness variation with all of these layers. You can switch to the roughness channel by hitting C on the viewport and set the value. I will adjust the curvature layer a bit. We can add higher roughness values for the ambient occlusion layer since that is usually where the dust collects the most. And also for the curvature, but not as intense as the ambient occlusion. That's pretty much it for the roughness. We can add a gradient to make it look more interesting. So add a new layer. Add a mask builder and we can use the gradient. I want it to affect the bottom part so we can invert it. We can move the 2 points using the move gizmos to adjust the gradient location. For the color on this one, we can try some dark red. We can change the blend mode. I like the way soft light looks. You can see the base color to have a better idea on what's happening. We can also add another gradient. Turn off the layer under it so we can see what's happening. And I just adjust the gradient to go across. Similar concept to the ID mask we made earlier. We need to set it to add so both of the layers work together. And you can go ahead and adjust the look of the gradient. In this case, we can put the gradient below the ambient occlusion and curvature, or just below the curvature, so that way it affects the color of the ambient occlusion. And that should do it for the wood material. You can work on this more, but for now we can move on. Again, you can come back once everything is done to adjust the colors and different values that we have set up. Even the dents we added were barely visible in this sculpt, but they show up well thanks to the curvature and the ambient occlusion maps. Next, we can start working on the metal. Now that we are done with the wood, we can start working on the metal. So turn on the folder for that. Let's set the base color for this. As you can see, it's only affecting the metal parts as we already created the ID mask for this folder. Rename the layer. Change the color to something gray. Turn on metalness and increase the value for metallic to 1. Right now the metal looks very shiny, so add some roughness. For the remaining layers, we can pretty much follow the same structure as we did for the wood. So I'm going to add these layers quickly. First do the noise, add a mask. For the grunge, we can try smudges. Solo the mask to adjust the parameters. We can add a slow pour filter to this as well, like we did with the noise for the word. So select the mask, add filter and select slow pour. Turn off the solo mode so we can see. For the slow pour, pick a noise. Let's change the color so we can see what's happening and adjust the values in the slope warp. We can change the blend mode for this to multiply and pick a proper color for this. We don't want it to be pure black. Also increase the roughness for this layer. Hit C to inspect the roughness. Next, we can do ambient occlusion. It seems to be working fine for the most part. We can change the color to something dark for this and set it to multiply. For the parts where we get ambient occlusion, I want a higher roughness value as that is where the dust usually collects. Add another layer for the curvature. Pick a brighter color. Add a mask builder for the curvature. Solo the mask to see the results. And adjust the values here. We can also try adding a grunge along with the curvature. Actually, we can try using a slope warp along with the ambient occlusion and the curvature as well. So let's give that a try. Use the clouds noise for this. And we can keep the intensity very low. Increase the scale. We just want to bring some irregularity to the edges. Next, we can adjust the color and try some different blend modes for this. Change the roughness for the edges with this. I want to exaggerate the dents that we made with the base color. Right now it's not really visible, so add another layer, call it dents. Pick a darker color. Add a mask builder. This time we will pick curvature again. But for the mode, change it to cavities. Adjust the values so the dents get covered. Let's see how that looks. Change it to multiply. We can lower the opacity. This is working well for the dents, but I don't really like this near the contact point for the bolts. I think the ambient occlusion added enough detail and this is a bit too much. We can try adjusting some values and see. This bottom part is where the lamp is contacting, so it's not a problem there. Since this is not working out, we can try to paint these parts out. So add the mask paint layer above this cavity mask. Set it to subtract. So whatever we paint white in this layer will be subtracted from all the layers below it, and we can just get to painting out the unwanted parts. Right now, this is just the default round brush. We don't really need to change anything, but we can try reducing the flow to get a more gradual transition. So the flow works somewhat like lowering the opacity for the brush, but not exactly the same. To get back the details, you can just change the color to black and paint. So we can get back the details on the bolts. By the way, you can change the size of the brush by holding Ctrl and dragging the mouse. Or you also have the radius value. That's pretty much it for painting in this layer. Now we pretty much just have the dents in this layer, and we also still have the ambient occlusion, which we can make darker if needed. Now you can give a gradient to each of these, which isn't really necessary as these are much smaller parts compared to the wood, and the gradient is a lot more visible from top to bottom on the wood. Let's just duplicate the gradient to try. Just select the layer and hit Ctrl D to duplicate. And I actually duplicated the curvature by accident, so just duplicate the gradient map and place it in the metal group. Make sure to drag it under the group, it might try to put it under the mask. For the color, pick something that's blue. Now just adjust the position for the gradient for the two layers like we did earlier for the wood. That should do it. We have a slight gradient that we can control the color for. Both of the main materials are done. We can put the gradient under the curvature. We can check the base color and it looks fine. And for the roughness, it's kind of hard to judge this exactly. I like to check it in Blender with proper lighting setup in cycles and then just come back and adjust any values that are needed. You can also try to use the other HDRIs that are available in the library to get a better idea on how the roughness looks. That's enough for the base for now. We can come back and make any changes later. Most of these are using a procedural approach with the mask builder except for the paint layers. So basically if we reuse this material, we have to adjust or completely replace the mask paint layers. So let's start with the lamp, turn on the visibility for it, and we can get to texturing with this. Now for the metal parts, we can simply reuse the metal material here. Just need to change the paint layer and adjust the remaining values according to the size of the object. So select the metal group, right click and copy. Go to the other material and just hit Ctrl V to paste it. If we turn off the ID mask, you can see that it works. This is one way to do this, but there's a much better option. We can add this material stack in the library in the layer material section, and we can save any layer groups here. If you come from Substance Painter, this is pretty much similar to creating smart materials. First, give the layer a unique name so it's easy to identify. Right click on the group and we can add this as a prefab material. Now that should be added under the layer materials category. And there you have it. There's a bunch of materials here by default that you can use in your projects and they work pretty well. If you only want to see the materials you added, you can turn on the show only user library content. And that's all the ones that you added. This other one here is just something that I was testing out earlier. Now go to the lamp light material and we can just drag and drop the material in the layers. I should have removed the ID mask before creating the layer prefab material, but it's not a big deal. You can certainly do that to make it easy to reuse. Let's just assign the ID mask to the lamp. Again, you cannot go higher than 10 in the ID mask. So just add another ID mask and set the blend mode to add. Let's just turn off the lamp structure so we can focus on the lamp. Now it doesn't look that great as we need to fine tune the values to fit the object. So let's just go one layer after another and start from the bottom. I'm just going to speed this part up a bit as I'm not really adding anything new and I'm only adjusting the values. just noticed that we have some artifacts here for the chain link, as we had them arrayed in Blender, and when we applied the modifier, they were made into a single object. And because of that, the ray distance is basically causing an overlap in the normal bake. Having the 3 chain links as separate objects would be the easiest solution to fix this. But for now, let's just move on. For the dents, we have to make more changes. Just delete the existing paint layer and add another mask paint layer. And we can paint out the unwanted parts. Let's just turn on the lamp structure to see how it looks as a whole. Add another group for the emissive part. Give it an ID mask and select the part. Now add a layer and we can have its color to be yellowish or orange. We can actually use the emissive channel in InstaMAT. Now most of the time you can simply do this with the shaders in your 3D application, but for now let's just try it. Now we have the emissive channel available. Let's put the layer in the group first, and you can just give it an emissive and change its color. That's good. But what I like to do is have the emissive part to be a bit brighter in the center and fade away as it goes to the top and bottom part of the lamp. So turn off the emissive and add another layer. Turn off the color for this and give it an emission color. Add a mask builder to this layer and we can use gradient. First position the gradient handles close to the lamp. Now we basically want the gradient to be white in the center and turn black at the top and bottom. So if we assume we have the light source at the center, it will be much brighter there. We can change the gradient from linear to symmetric. Now we get this, but we want it to be inverted. So it's white on the inside. For that we have the invert option. Now it's just a matter of positioning and adjusting the contrast, brightness and balance values. Since this is for the tutorial, I'm trying to make it quick, although it's a pretty long video. But if I were to normally work on such a model, I would spend more time on texturing and adjust any little mistakes and add more story details to the textures. Now I was trying to adjust the blend modes and opacity and wondering why nothing was working. But then I realized since we are in the emissive channel, the blend modes and opacity are for the emissive, so we had to switch this to the base color. I just wanted to include this bit because it's a silly mistake, but it happens usually. So just keep a note of this. Now, something that I like to do with some of the stylized props is to use some form of baked lighting in the textures. So let's just try that here. Add a new layer on top. Just pick a bright yellow color for now. For the layer, similar to how we use pick from library for the filter to get more options, we can do the same for the mask. So pick from library, and there's quite a few masks that are available. The one that we can use is the mesh backlight. So you are basically using a light source. It can be a point light, area light, or even a directional light, and baking the details directly onto the textures. This is nice for some stylized art. It's not suitable for everything. It totally depends on how you use the prop. You can change the light mode and it basically works how you would expect lights to work in any 3D software. You can have more lights, up to 3 in one mask layer. You also have the ambient light option, which is basically the color of the world or atmosphere. And you can use this in a separate layer with a bluish color for something like the ambient lighting from the sky. Here you also have the value for the specular light, which you can use to control the shine. Now it's never going to be this harsh, so just change the blend mode to something like soft light or add and keep the opacity pretty low. This is one way to do this, but we can also try other ways. Let's duplicate the layer, and for this delete the bake lighting mask and add a normal mask builder. For this, choose direction. This looks more like a single directional lighting look. It's not as detailed as adding lights, but it's quick and easy, and adjust the values for the mask. Now it's totally up to you to choose which one you want to use. It completely depends on the style that you're going for. Remember to only use something like bake lighting if you know how the prop will be placed and know the final lighting condition. It only works to enhance the lighting setup, but if the lighting is different to what we are doing in the texturing, it will work against it. So that's pretty much it for texturing. We can copy the baked light layers to the lamp as well. Now I wanted to quickly show how to fix the baking artifacts we have here with the chain links. The normal map is the problem as the bakes are overlapping, and the easiest fix would be to separate these three links into individual objects. For that, I just went back into Blender, separated these into three parts for the low poly and high poly. Also, these were offset by a bit because we applied the subdivision modifier, so I just moved them so the high poly would properly overlap with the low poly. So that's pretty much it for the changes. If you get any other artifacts with objects overlapping, you can use this way to fix them. Just make sure to give them unique names, matching the low poly and high poly with proper suffixes. And I just exported these as low poly and high poly files with all of the objects. Now we just have to replace the low poly model, so that way we will retain all the layers we created. And since we have the same UV map and just change the naming for the objects, it shouldn't cause any issues with the hand painted parts either. You can directly replace them, but I would suggest you to make a copy of this project. It's not necessary, but if there happens to be any problems with reimporting, you can just fall back to the other file. First, save the current file with Ctrl S. Then go to File and Save Project Copy. That will create a duplicate for the project. Now we can just take the low poly FBX file and drag it into the viewport. And we get this pop-up about how you want to load the mesh into the project. You can just hit copy to project and that will update the low poly mesh in the project. Now we need to bake again, and since we have the three chain links separated, we can use the new high poly FBX file. So open up baking, pick the new high poly as the source mesh. The by mesh name and rest of these settings are already set. Let's just bake the tangent normals and see if it works. So go ahead and hit the bake. The baking is done. If we hit C to view the normal channel, you can see the normal map doesn't have any artifacts like we saw earlier. We still have to fix the curvature and ambient occlusion, so let's bake those now. Alright, as you can see, the issue is completely gone and we have good ambient occlusion details. That's pretty much it. Let's save the file. Since we saved a copy, we can still check the previous file. This should have the artifacts because we created new bake images. So if you look at images, we have the new ones and the old ones. And you can compare the two normal maps. This was where we had issues with the normal bake and we fixed that. If needed, you can replace the normal map for the material with the new fixed normal maps. Anyways, I'm just going to leave this and we can use the duplicated project and export the textures. Like I mentioned, you don't need to make a duplicate copy if you're familiar with what you're doing. This is just to be on the safe side. Okay, that's it for texturing this asset. Feel free to make any changes as you like and just export the textures. open up the export window on the top. I have the base color, normal and emissive maps, and I also have the ambient occlusion, roughness and metalness channel packed into a single ORM texture map. If you don't know how to do that, just add an RGBA output, call it ORM for occlusion, roughness and metalness, and you can just drag and drop the corresponding output templates. So go ahead and export these, and we will look at the asset with all the textures applied in Blender. Here is the final model. I have everything set up with the textures and a basic lighting setup. This is in cycles, but for now let's look at the EV render results. I just have the two lights for the lamp. And for the shading, I just have the textures connected normally for the base color, emissive and normal map. This is the channel packed ORM map. I just duplicated the base color, but we can change the label. With this, I'm using a separate color node to split the RGB channels, and I'm multiplying the ambient occlusion in the red channel with the base color, and also connect the roughness and metallic maps. The same thing for the other material. And for the lamp, I have the emission strength increased. Since we have an emissive map, it's only affecting this part. Again, I'm using 2 point lights next to the lamp. I have a night HDRI setup as well, so we can check the lighting in that. It is hard to set the roughness without testing different lighting setups. So now that we saw how the model looks in Blender, we can go back and adjust the roughness. Anyways, that's pretty much it for the tutorial. I hope you guys found this video helpful. Leave a like and subscribe for more videos on texturing, InstaMAT and Blender. And as always, thank you for watching.